Hello there, and welcome to another episode of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story. This week, you guys are in for a special treat. I am going to play the first episode of The Hidden Files for my regular listeners, which is the story of the life and assassination attempts on one Mr. Fidel Castro. Let me tell you guys, I had no idea that our own CIA tried so many ways to kill this man. The stories are nuts. Remember, the Hidden Files are just $3 a month for 2 extra bonus episodes of things surrounding and including true crime, but they are a little different than our regular Monday episodes. The Hidden Files are offered over on the Patreon app or now on Spotify as well. I hope you guys enjoy hearing this first episode, and I hope you guys will join the rest of us in listening to the stories twice a month. See you guys next Monday, and happy listening. Welcome to The Hidden Files, an extension of your favorite podcast, TheKillFile. Here we will cover different stories and cases than we normally would. This is the place where we will get to learn about various people and places in a setting that will be a little lighter than the dark corners of true crime. Get ready for a wild journey into some great tales with twists, laughs, and commentary from yours truly. Hey guys, welcome to The Hidden File, aka bonus content from TheKillFile. Since this is newer, I just want to say that these will be slightly shorter bonus episodes about different things from natural disasters to assassinations to listener files. So, if you want one of your true crime stories read here on TheKillFile, then write it in at thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com for a chance to get it read on an episode. Anything from like a hometown murder to a robbery you saw, or maybe your mom saw and casually dropped the story one day. Rate, subscribe, and review to help the podcast reach other people. And as usual, don't forget to check out the website at thekillfile.com. Click shop merch and find something that you love for true crime merch. That's it for business. Let's talk about today's episode. Today we are going to cover the assassination of a man that we have all heard of named Fidel Castro. If you're like me and you know the name and a little bit about him, but not enough to hold up a conversation about him in a group of people without looking like a moron, then we will cover who he was, what he did, and apparently he has some insane assassination attempts on his life that I cannot believe are even real. Here we go. First thing I want to say is that Fidel Castro is debated to this day on whether he was a tyrant or a hero. Depending on who you ask, you may get different answers. We are going to start off today with a little history on who this man was, because first off, I had no idea. And secondly, when we talk about the assassination attempts from our own CIA on this man, we need to have a sense of just why they tried so hard to take this guy out. Fidel Castro was born on August 13th, 1926 in southeastern Cuba. His father, a man named Ángel Castro y Arguez, who was originally an immigrant from Spain, was a wealthy man, being a farmer of sugarcane fields. Apparently, the location that Castro's father had this particular farm was usually somewhere that had always been ran by the U.S.-owned fruit company. Ángel at the time was married, but started to have a secret affair with a servant named Lina Ruiz Gonzalez. Lina would later on end up married to Ángel, and together the couple would go on to have 7 children, including Fidel and his brother named Raul. Fidel Castro ended up attending what was said to be a Roman Catholic boarding school, and this was located in Santiago de Cuba. He then attended Belén, a Catholic high school. However, this school was located in Havana, and here Castro was a pretty good athlete. He would play basketball, baseball, ping pong, and did events with track like high jump and something called middle distance running, which I'm just assuming is somewhere between sprints and long-distance running, but I've never heard of it. He was actually named, quote-unquote, Havana's outstanding schoolboy sportsman in 1943 to 1944. What a title. Castro would go on after high school to attend law school in 1945 at the School of Law of the University of Havana. It was said that Castro's main interest while in school was politics, and he had attended some invasions and riots that had broken out in April of 1948. When Castro would graduate college in 1950, he would go on to start practicing law, and then he would become a member of the Ortodoxos, which was a reformist group of the Cuban People's Party, aka political party. So, fun fact, the Cuban People Party was actually created in 1943 by a former student activist named Eduardo Chivas. Eduardo had actually grown a big national following because he had weekly radio broadcasts. He actually launched what one source called a national crusade against corruption in their government and promised to clean up Cuba's politics. So, Castro was part of this group who really seemed to want to hold up what they say were Cuba's revolutionary traditions. After becoming a member of the Cuban People Party, Castro actually was their candidate for place, or a seat, in their House of Representatives, and this would be from the Havana district, where elections were to be held in June of 1952. However, in March of 1952, a former Cuban president named General Fulgencio Batista ended up overthrowing the government during the presidency of Carlos Prior Socaras, and then he canceled the elections. Can you imagine how scary this would be? I mean, it's not like we're very far off from that with certain administrations trying to sneak shit in and out of policies and laws, but to just have someone come in and have all the power and as a voter having no voice, it's scary to think of, isn't it? Let's cross our fingers that we will never see this in our lifetime, if you know what I mean. Moving on. Castro tried to appeal to the Supreme Court to get rid of Batista and his newfangled dictatorship, but as you can imagine, that didn't go as planned. So, Castro started to organize a rebel force for this particular task in 1953. Castro would lead a group of what was said to be about 160 men in what one source would call a suicidal mission attack on the Moncada military barracks located in Santiago de Cuba, and this was July 26th in the year of 1953. This would be seen as Castro's real first appearance, and the attack was aimed to hopefully start an uprising. Sadly, most of Fidel's group of men were killed. It was known that Batista had an army and the mafia was apparently in his pocket. So Fidel was arrested, but his brother Raul was able to escape. Castro would be sentenced to a whopping 15 years in prison for his offense, even though his defense was said to be extremely moving and passionate. Thankfully for Castro, he was released in 1955 in political amnesty, and the group headed to Mexico in order to pursue their campaign against Batista. It was said that during this time, many Cuban groups were starting to oppose Batista, and the United States actually ended their military aid to his cause. Castro would go with an armed group of about 81 men on December 2nd, 1956, to the eastern coast of Cuba, where they had descended from a yacht called Granma. All of the men that were with Castro and Raul were killed, except for the brothers and 9 other men. They all retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. They would wage guerrilla warfare against Batista's forces. So, I've heard this term before, but I had no idea what it meant, so I had to look it up because, hello, I'm a historical dipshit and I don't know anything. Guerrilla warfare is defined as irregular military actions like a sabotage or a harassment, and it's usually carried out by an independent and also usually a small force instead of a huge army or whatever. Castro's team would eventually win some victories over Batista's armed forces because there had been a growing number of volunteers wanting to join in the revolution throughout the island. Apparently, Batista's military was poorly led and feeling defeated. Batista had less and less support, and after many military defeats were accomplished, Batista actually fled the country on January 1st, 1959. The numbers were incomprehensible, at the army having around 30,000 soldiers, and Castro's guerrilla attacks would gain about 800 people in support. After this, Castro would go on to be Cuba's armed forces commander-in-chief, and at the time there seemed to be a temporary government in place that had a moderate liberal president named Manuel Urrutia. Eventually, though, Urrutia was forced to resign, and Castro was basically in political power at the time with the backing of many city dwellers in Cuba, and this was in July of 1959. Castro had made many promises to the people, which I think we all know doesn't usually happen the way whichever politician says, and it can leave people feeling cheated. Some of the promises Castro made to his people were, for example, moderate reforms, an honest administration, to reinstate full political and civil liberties, and he promised to restore the 1940 Constitution. However, once Castro was in power, it could be seen that he actually began to seek out much more radicalized policies. Things that actually ended up taking place were things like large-scale land reforms, both private and industrialized commerce were nationalized, and American agricultural estates and businesses were taken away. This pissed off the United States because the states felt alienated by Castro's actions. Castro himself was often touted as anti-American. Apparently, at first, the US had recognized Castro, but after he would start to change things, that quickly stopped, and some of Cuba's wealthiest citizens had fled to the United States, eventually joining the CIA efforts to overthrow Castro. Castro also made a trade agreement with the Soviet Union, which further led the US to dislike Castro. Most of the Cuban and American economic ties were essentially severed, and then in January of 1961, the US broke diplomatic relations with the country. In April of 1961, the American government had, I guess, secretly, according to Britannica, quote, equipped thousands of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro's government. Their landing at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, however, was crushed by Castro's armed forces, end quote. After the attack, the Soviet Union upped their support to Castro. Cuba started buying weapons from the Soviet Union at this point, and the Soviet Union quickly became their top supporter. In 1962, the Soviet Union would actually place offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba, right in the middle of Castro's communist government. When the U.S. found out about the missiles, it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which would end after the Soviet Union agreed to remove the nukes from Cuba, and in exchange, America would pledge not to invade Cuba, seeking to overthrow Castro, and if the U.S. would also move their nuclear missiles that were stationed in Turkey. It was said that Castro's version of communistic Cuba was the first of its kind in the Western Hemisphere, and Castro was able to retain his control well into the 2000s. I didn't know that. He had adopted what was called a Marxism-Leninism ideology, which, after researching, was the same as Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. 9 different American presidents opposed Castro, however, he outlasted them all. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Castro had lost one of his best aides, but through European and Canadian investment and through tourism, he was able to make up for the lacking aid. Castro was able to create his own one-party government where he would be able to control every aspect of the government, including economic and cultural life as well. Can you imagine if this happened here in the U.S.? One person should never hold that much control. While the wealthier of Cuba's citizens, including the middle class, were feeling betrayed and had left for America, Castro had expanded his country's social services, and this had extended to benefit all classes of society equally. It was said that health and educational services had been made available to every Cuban citizen, and they were both free, while each and every person was also guaranteed a job. Unfortunately for Castro, the country failed to grow in any significant way, and it was unable to reduce its dependency on what they exported in this country the most, which is cane sugar. So because Castro was not a great manager of economics, the agriculture became stagnant, and Cuba would become more and more dependent on Soviet trades to maintain any type of standard of living, while the U.S. was still not interested in trading with Cuba at all. So throughout the years, Castro would involve his troops in different less developed countries' conflicts, including fighting in the Angolan Civil War on the side of the Communist Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, as well as assisting the Ethiopian nation in keeping out the invasion of Somalia. Eventually, during the 80s, Castro had made clear his willingness to renew diplomatic relations with the U.S. if it was willing to end its trade revocation with Cuba. It was said in 1980, Castro actually released a large amount of immigrants into the U.S. while he had opened something called the Port of Mariel, and this was for 5 months. Apparently, around 125,000 immigrants, and some were known criminals, came into the U.S. and had strained what was said to be the capacity of the United States immigration's facilities. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Castro was forced to shift due to less money now being given to him from that country. He did this by allowing some free market activities and economic liberalization, but kept tight controls on politics in Cuba. It was said in the later part of 1993, Castro's own daughter fled to the U.S., criticizing her own father's rulings and sought asylum here in the U.S. The next year, anti-government demonstrations took place larger and greater than Cuba had ever seen. Castro had, I guess, lifted some restrictions on citizens wanting to leave the country, and this is when thousands would head to the U.S. In 2003, Castro was confirmed as president for yet another 5-year term by the National Assembly, and there were also dozens of activists and independent journalists arrested in crackdowns of people opposing Castro's politics. 75 different people were actually convicted for conspiracy with the US for undermining the revolution. In 2008, Castro wrote a letter right before the National Assembly was about to vote on another term, saying that he was stepping down and would not accept another term. Many people in the country took this as a final admission that communism does not work. Okay, so that's the background on Fidel Castro, most of which I didn't know in the least, but now let's talk about the assassination attempts on his life. It was said that there were at least 634 different attempts on Castro's life, all of which he survived, which is fucking nuts. Some of which would prove to be almost, quote, obsessive, error-prone assassination campaigns by the CIA, end quote. One of the most famous CIA assassination attempts was in 1960 when the CIA frickin' poisoned a box of Castro's favorite cigars. I noticed early on in almost all of his pictures and in a little video that I had started watching that all of the footage of Castro was him or those around him. They were all smoking cigars. It was just kind of part of their everyday. 1 year after Castro was able to seize power of his country, the CIA had actually spiked a box of his favorite cigars with a botulinum toxin, I don't know if I said that right, which was said to be strong enough to kill any person who would have put any of these in their mouth. Unfortunately for the CIA, these cigars were delivered to a quote-unquote unidentified person in 1961. We also have no idea what happened to them after that. Can you imagine? Oh my god, you go to open a box of cigars and you put one in your mouth and then you just fucking fall over and die? Oh my god! This try was often called the exploding cigar in a ton of articles, which is confusing to me because they were actually poisoned, but alright. Another attempt came in the form of gangsters. Yes, gangsters. At the end of President Eisenhower's term, the CIA would ask a bunch of middlemen if they could gain the help of two separate gangsters to take Castro out. The CIA was willing to pay $150,000, which is over $1 million today, to have him quote-unquote removed. The gangsters' names were Sam Giancana, which was actually the boss of Chicago's mob, and a man named Santos Traficant, who at the time was the head of Cuba's mob operations. Both of these men were said to be already on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Can you believe this shit? It sounds like a fucking movie. It was Giancana's idea to use poisoned pills, saying that he believed those to be much more reliable than guns. The CIA then provided him with 6, quote, lethal high-content pills to a paid-off Cuban official who would have access to Castro to be able to use the pills on him. Apparently, after multiple attempts to use the pills, the Cuban got scared and abandoned the plan, which I don't blame him. Okay, this one made me laugh. Someone inside of the CIA had a grand idea in 1963, and we will call it Pretty Seashell. So officials inside thought they may be able to use Castro's scuba diving fondness to take him out. Apparently, he was an avid scuba diver, and the CIA thought that they may be able to hide explosives underneath a seashell that they would paint with exotic colors that they believed would lure Castro to it, intrigued. Of course, this plan ended up being deemed impractical and trashed, but yes, at one point, someone had the bright idea to blow him up underwater with a pretty seashell. Holy shit. The next assassination plan was the same year as the seashell, so 1963. And this time, the CIA wanted to fuck with one of Castro's diving suits with some sort of fungus that would end up giving Castro a debilitating and horrifically chronic skin disease. After a little research, although I did try and read the abstracts on what it does to a person and still couldn't get a straight answer, what they wanted to use in his diving suit was called Eumycota fungi. The contaminated suit was supposed to be given to Castro by a man named James Donovan, who was an American lawyer and had been involved in some hostage negotiations with Castro. The plan was screwed up with Donovan, and he gave Castro a different suit, but the man who later became the director of the CIA, named Richard Helms, said that the suit never actually left the lab, so maybe it was just kind of a missed opportunity. I feel like I'm telling you guys an episode of Looney Tunes where the coyote is trying to get the Roadrunner. The next attempt is a story of a woman named Marita Lorenz, who had been 19 when she fell in love with Castro in February of 1959. They're not in order, as you can see. She met him when he boarded her father's ship, and when she got back to New York, she would receive a call that Castro wanted her there next to him. She ended up living for 8.5 months in a hotel located in Havana that Castro would eventually turn into headquarters when he seized power. She would say that Castro was a narcissist and thought very highly of himself. Marita then says in her younger years and at the time that she was young, dumb, and submissive and believed everything that he told her. When Marita became pregnant with his son, it didn't go as she had thought, and apparently there are a few stories of actually what happened during her pregnancy. However, Marita herself says that she remembers the last thing as being given a glass of milk and being told to drink it. She says that she was drugged and confused, and this was when she was 8 months pregnant. She remembers waking up in a room in horrific pain, and that's all she can remember. So she isn't sure to this day whether that baby lived or died, but she was no longer pregnant, which is just sickening. Marita says she was sent back to the U.S. still bleeding from whatever they did to her in Havana, where she ended up being admitted into the hospital, and this was the Roosevelt Hospital. This is where the CIA would introduce themselves to Marita. She would say the CIA came right up to her in the hospital in New York. She said the CIA told her that they had her signature and now she worked for them. They told her they wanted her to put him to sleep or neutralize him, and if she would be able to pull this off, she would be a hero to the American people. After she was released from Roosevelt Hospital, she had the pills the CIA gave her and she went back to the hotel in Havana. She later described laying down in bed next to Castro where he asked if she had come to harm him, and she replied, quote, "I came to kill you." But Marita said her love for Castro wouldn't let her do it. She put the pills in a jar of skin cream and later flushed the pills. She now feels remorse that she couldn't be the person who the Cuban citizens needed in order to change history. She did, however, continue to work with the U.S. government and groups against Castro. She would later on say she was Castro's lover once again, and this time they had a child named Monica Perez Jimenez. She later, back in New York, worked for the FBI and had a son. She later wrote a book about her whole life adventure called The Spy Who Loved Castro, if anyone's interested in reading it. Okay, on to the next assassination attempt. The next attempt is touted as straight out of a Bond movie, which is because the next plan had to do with a hypodermic needle that would be concealed in a pen. It was alleged the needle was going to be so small that Castro wouldn't even feel it when it penetrated his skin. The needle pen was supposed to be triggered by a, quote, highly placed Cuban official who had been talking with the CIA on the low. Apparently, it was the Cuban official that had thought the device was kind of stupid and said that he thought the CIA could, quote, come up with something more sophisticated than that, end quote. If he only knew how hard they've been trying. I guess the pen was also horribly timed because the official was offered the pen on November 22nd in 1963, which I guess is the day of JFK's assassination. This made the official withdraw the support of Castro's assassination, and he never even took the pen to Cuba with him. Finally, the last attempt of the CIA on Castro was not for his life, but rather an attempt to change his image as the leader of his public and change their views of him. Apparently, the U.S. had also attempted to vilify him in his country in other ways, not just attempted assassinations. This time, the CIA wanted to sabotage Castro's speeches to his public, and they did this by spraying the studio that broadcasted his speeches with a chemical that would make him hallucinate, closely resembling LSD. However, this was, of course, abandoned when they realized that the chemical wasn't stable enough. Jesus, 1960s CIA, they are some hardcore motherfuckers. It was said at one point the CIA tried to spike his cigars with a different chemical that would make Castro disoriented, and they had hoped that he would smoke one of these cigars before one of his public appearances. Apparently, our country tried to fuck this man up in numerous different ways, from attempted assassinations to just making him look foolish to his country in hopes that he wouldn't be seen the same to his people. One of the funniest I had heard of is when they attempted to dust Castro's shoes with something called thallium salts, and this would have made Castro's iconic beard fall out. There were other reports of an alleged poisoned... Oh my God. There were other reports of an alleged poisoned chocolate milkshake at the Havana Hotel, explosives hidden under a podium that he was supposed to speak at while he was traveling, a sniper recruited by the CIA from Cuba who was an exiled person but was caught by security, and even a grenade attack at a baseball game, which also failed. Fidel Castro would end up dying of natural causes on November 26, 2016, if you can believe it. The man was 90 years old. And that, my friends, is the story and the assassination attempts of our own CIA, against Fidel Castro. I mean, this guy, right? It's like the guy who would not die. I could not believe the numerous ways in which this man was attempted to be assassinated. What the fuck? Also, so you see this kind of stuff on TV, but hearing that it's actually carried out and tried like actual biochemical warfare attempts, that shit is so scary and also makes you wonder what kind of attempts are being put on people right now. Look, I personally am not against assassinations if it's for the greater good and protecting our citizens. In a perfect world, we'd be able to capture or put horrific men or women to justice, but that's just not how our system works, really. And powerful and corrupt men or women seem to be able to get away with whatever the fuck they want. No one can or will do anything about it until someone steps up to the plate with an idea. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like there are worse people out there now than Fidel Castro, no? Maybe I didn't find all of the horrific things this man did in my research, but I just feel like if the CIA was so fixated on him, why can't they fixate on predators or other disgusting people in power the same way? Maybe they do. Well, that wraps up this hidden file, and I hope to see you guys tune in for our next regular episode on Mondays. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today's Hidden Files. Do you have a story that you want me to cover? Please submit it on the website, TheKillFile.com. And while you're there, take a look at the merch website for some fun true crime merch and to help support the podcast. Have a comment or something to add? Follow us on the TheKillFile social media platforms. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to help boost the podcast where others can find us and listen as well. I hope to see you guys next time here on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.